welcome to people who have joined so far. I'll make a start. Welcome to our third webinar that we've had in this series now. And it's been a real pleasure to be able to share some of our ideas and our research and our thinking about how we deal with some of these major challenges in the world at the moment that we're seeking to move forward and deal with, that are major crises that we're facing. And we've been building up various ideas, and today we're looking particularly at what does that mean in the workplace? What does that mean for work? Welcome to us. Myself and Matthijs have been working together on this project 3 or 4 years now, and as well as the research and the thinking we're talking about today, we're actually working on, and we've recently had validated a new programme which captures a number of the themes that we're talking about today. So we will spend a little bit of time at the end talking about our new programme, which is a Master in Sustainable Business Administration. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. Welcome to the webinar. Real opportunity for us to share some of our thoughts about different ways of teaching, perhaps. Ultimately, our goal is to perhaps rethink the way we do higher education, and in a way that does make a real impact on society. I think the term social impact is becoming more and more of a term in society, and as educators and responsible educators, we're really keen that we make a real world impact on these challenges that we're facing in society and the transformation we need to bring about to a fairer, more sustainable society. And we take quite a critical approach, so we're trying to question the way things are done. We know we need to radically change the way things are done. So what are our common assumptions that we have now? How do we need to rethink those through a different lens? I'm really pleased to work with my colleague and friend Matthijs today, who's a Professor of Responsible Management at the Business School. Just a little bit about the shape of that, what we're doing today. So I'm just making a start and introducing some of the ideas and themes that we've been developing. And then the second part, Matthijs will build on some of those ideas. And what does that mean for the future, how we can develop things. And then we'll have a break for perhaps to pick up any questions we have and take it forward in a bit of a dialogue. And then we'll round things off towards the end, just to introduce the new programme that I mentioned. I'll just pause while Matthijs just steps in the room just to say hello at the start, just so he gets a chance to introduce himself.
Thank you, Andy. Hi, welcome to our third webinar, actually, in preparation for our MSBA. So my name is Matthijs Bal. I'm a Professor of Responsible Management at the Business School in Lincoln. And as Andy already mentioned, we have developed our new MSBA program over the last 2-3 years or so. And our program will commence in September. And in preparation of the launch of our program, we are holding a series of webinars around the themes that we will also be dealing with in the actual program. And but Andy, please go ahead with your part.
Okay, thanks, Matthijs. So we've developed over the first 2 webinars, we've developed a number of different themes, trying to explore really and understand why we're unable to really make meaningful impact on some of the sustainable challenges and crises that society faces. First seminar really looked at trying to understand why, despite 20 or 30 years of businesses engaging in corporate social responsibility, that this far down the line we're still causing major damage to our environment, still consuming resources at an unsustainable rate, high levels of pollution, but also still seeing large levels of inequality and social harm as well. So our overall argument is, how do we do things differently? In the second webinar, we took up some ideas to think, what can we learn from the current crisis, the current COVID crisis, and explored what that tells us about sustainability. So this third one, we're building on those ideas and really looking at what does that mean in workplaces. Really, work is something that's important for everybody. Most people have to earn a living at some stage in their life, and much of our life is spent at work. And really, it's important that ideas of sustainability exist in the workplace as well. So that's particularly what we're looking at work. And really, when we've said truly sustainable, what do we mean by that? Well, I think the word sustainability and sustainable is a widely used word. It's used in lots of different contexts. In here, we're meaning truly sustainable in terms of socially sustainable and environmentally sustainable. Is it causing harm? Can it be sustained the way we do things? Or are we continuing to cause damage socially to our employees, people that engage with organisations, not just the environment? So truly sustainable in the broadest sense. But also truly in the sense of really happening. Truly in terms of actually sustainable. Because we've moved to a position, and we chatted about this in the previous seminars, that we've created different versions of reality, that we talk about sustainability, but often it's a rhetoric. There's a lot of talk about sustainability. It can often be considered to be public relations, rather than the actual reality on the ground. So we're talking about how can we have actual sustainable workplaces that are genuinely sustainable. And really, we're building on the position that we've really made insufficient, and we're making insufficient progress now on addressing a number of these major crises, whether it's the climate crisis, like financial crisis, which hit the world in 2008, but is still having a major impact on our economies and our public services. And of course, other crises around health and inequality. And we can see that in our current situation where we've got an inequality in access to vaccines around the world. So we've still got high profile situations of inequality and unfairness. And one of the ideas that we developed and we're thinking about is, how do we achieve this transformation to a fairer society? And clearly that has to happen at lots of different levels. And we see coming up in Glasgow later this year, there's a huge climate change conference where world leaders and politicians will get together. Well, that's, I think, part of the picture of bringing about change is that global political, governmental level. And then at the other level, we've got, as individuals, we're making choices as consumers and citizens to bring about change. But there's a huge gap in the middle of society of organisations starting to bring about change. But we feel there's also the area of the professions. And in most organisations have professionals and linked to professional bodies. So what does it mean going forward to move towards responsible professions, sustainable professions? What does it mean for a profession like human resources, who are really the main players that, or one of the key players for influencing how sustainable workplaces are? If human resource management and people management isn't sustainable, that's unlikely that we're going to really make an impact on making our workplaces sustainable. So really what we're looking at today, this first part that I'm doing, is really asking this question: how responsible is human resource management? How responsible is the way we manage people? And As I mentioned earlier, we've got a challenge really, because the word sustainability, it's very embedded in our language now, well embedded in popular culture now, but in some ways they've become, along with a concept like corporate social responsibility, they've become rather empty concepts. People talk about them, they can mean lots of things in many situations, but their meaning has somewhat been diluted. And really, we're looking to revisit some of the meaning of some of these words and concepts, perhaps to return a bit more power to them. And particularly, we're very keen to reclaim the powerful meaning of responsibility. Responsibility in terms of really taking our responsibility seriously. And we're looking to try and think of different ways how we might consider responsibility and offer perhaps some new definitions, generate some more meaningful meaning or clearer meaning to the word responsibility. And we spoke in a previous webinar about responsible management being something based around care. That ultimately it's about having a care for the world and society around us. And responsibility really starts from care. And it's not just about our legal responsibilities, it's about having a moral duty of care as well. So we're quite familiar with the phrase of duty of care. But really, in terms of genuinely responsible management, it's about having a much broader duty of care, which is not just our legal requirements, but what is the right thing to do. And not just thinking about the organisation itself and the organisation's objectives and its people. Actually, what's the duty of care to people beyond the organisation? So we're trying to generate a new meaning around that. And something that's usable, that's meaningful. So we can ask the question about HR practitioners and HR practice. They have a key role in sustainable workplaces, but how genuinely responsible is that profession, is that practice? I think if we look at the evidence, and the evidence of workplaces, of work in contemporary society, we have to be straightforward that there's still elements of failure. There's evidence of failure there. And we can't say at the moment that HRM, HR practice, HR professionals have really enabled where we are now to have a truly sustainable workplace. And a number of these measures are unfortunately going in the wrong direction. So it's not as if in some cases we're making steady progress. In-work poverty has actually increased. So this is a recent figure that more than half of the people in the UK who are in poverty are actually working. And that is slowly increased over the last decade. So some of those are related to the practices which we manage people by, the way we manage people in organisations, the way we have fair pay, and the way we spread pay around an organisation. So pay for chief executives has gone up dramatically over the past 10 years, but we've got more people in work in poverty. So there's absurdity and unfairness now there. In terms of workplace practice and people management, the evidence is that actually people are, if anything, there's a health crisis in organisations, particularly around mental health, some of the invisible health issues. We've done quite a good job in the UK over the past 100 years of really dramatically improving health and physical health and safety at work. But there's a huge hidden aspect of mental health at work, work-related stress. And that's a tremendous figure, 38 million days lost. That's 38 million days of illness, people not able to work, and harm caused by work. So that is a failure if work is still harming people. Still many people reporting bullying, despite all the procedures and policies that we have. Job insecurity, perhaps linked to changes in technology, but large proportions of people still feeling very insecure at work. And actually people's workers' rights have probably been eroded rather than becoming stronger. So again, another diminution, that things are perhaps getting worse rather than better. And another example is the gender pay gap. We've still got a gender pay gap, irrespective of the legislation and procedures. We're making some progress in that area, but there's still that huge inequality just based on gender. And the same goes for other diversity diverse groups as well, where we've got pay gaps and inequality. So the evidence is there's a long way to go. We can't say that work and workplaces are truly sustainable. Part of our programme that we've been mentioning, we're basing that on an approach, if you like, to deal with these problems, where we look at the problem and try to understand the problem, and then to understand and analyse the problem before we can start imagining how to deal with the problem. And perhaps one of the barriers to dealing with these issues is because we haven't previously delved sufficiently deeply to understand the problem. So how can we problematise this idea of the work and the workplace? How can we problematise the profession of HRM? And how can we theorise or offer some explanations of why it's so difficult to change, why these issues are still there and perhaps not improving? So as an example of that, just to offer an argument, if you like, or a story of why that is. Some of it, I would argue, is about HRM and the nature of the profession and the way it's structured. The HRM actually has got a very narrow purpose. Rather than it being able to fulfill a wider duty of care, its focus is on quite a narrow responsibility, and primarily focused on an organisational focus, a corporate focus, on the organisation's objectives and the employer and the senior decision makers. So it's very difficult for HRM to demonstrate a wider duty of care, both within and beyond the organisation, because its function and its purpose and its role has been quite narrowly focused on the interests of the employer, not so much on the employee. The other part of that focus is the way that the practice and profession of HR is developed. It's been very much developed on conventional models of strategic management that's based on looking at what are the organisational objectives, and everything is focused on those objectives. And there's little critique on those objectives themselves. Are those organisational objectives responsible in themselves? They might improve efficiency and profitability, but what are the downsides in terms of the human and social impacts and the environmental impacts? So it's the narrow purpose, but also this narrow focus often on very narrow organisational objectives. And the profession and the practice has also been very focused on performance. Again, flowing down from this narrow organisational interest, narrow focus on objectives, a unitary model of organisation based on a common set of objectives, and ignoring wider interests of the wider community and the wider environment. And a perception of both of people who perceive HR and the profession itself, that it provides that discipline and control and enforcement role in organisations, which can also limit the extent to which it can provide this genuine duty of care. So this narrow purpose constrains HR from becoming genuinely responsible. The second part is, in terms of a lack of power and autonomy, the strength of HR to provide this wider role, to create a wider role for itself, is limited by the profession and HR professionals in organisations really lacking sufficient agency and autonomy to actually shape and strengthen their role. So even though many professionals, and there's a dialogue in HR about becoming more responsible, to take a more responsible and sustainable role, really HR still tends to lack the organisational status and the organisational influence to be able to bring about that change, to bring about a broader duty of care, to fulfil that more widely, even though many professionals are seeking to do that. And there's something about the organisation. We look about sustainability, we look about diversity. The HR profession tends to lack diversity itself, but in counter to many of the senior boards in organisations, which are still predominantly male, we've got a gender inequality in HR, which I think also has a detrimental effect on its strength and its status in the organisation. It's actually seen as a much more deferential and subservient service in the organisation. And that means it's uncritical, and it has a limited effect on holding power to account, which we need to do if we're going to move our organisations forward. So again, that's another barrier or constraint on HR being able to move forward. And the third argument really is this idea that much of HRM practice is limited to rather prescriptive and technical solutions. But actually, it's very much focused on procedures and solving problems, maybe solving problems like the mental health issue and bullying and all these other issues, that the primary means to solve those is based on a more mechanical model of organisations, that if we can create the exact procedures, that the outcomes will follow from that. So it's quite a technical, narrow approach. And often it can be considered, many of the practices that are engaged in have often been described as isomorphic. So we adopt practices because other organisations do them as well. So we just really pick up practices from elsewhere. If we think of something like the common appraisal process, I don't think organisations thought, well, what would be a good way to develop people? They actually thought, well, we need to be valid, we need to have respect, we need to do what other organisations do. So there's much of the practices are just adopted because it's seen as the practice, rather than it necessarily being effective or responsible. And it's often normative in terms of saying what ought to be done, rather than reflecting what is done. And often I see examples when we see something in the news where an organisation that has been a problem, there has been a failure, we often get a press release saying, well, we've got plenty of policies in place to stop this. And it's absurd because the news item really is about failure. But then the reaction of the organisation is, well, we've got the policies in place to stop it. So there's been a separation from reality there. And this mechanical internal focus really means the profession and people involved in people management, it somewhat limits that sociological imagination beyond this mechanical metaphor, to look beyond the organisation, to think about how does that duty of care act beyond the organisation, act into society. So a broader sociological view of how the organisation sits in and has a responsibility to society. From that imagination bit, I'm going to smoothly hand over to Matthijs to pick up from there.
Thank you, Andy, for your introduction and more or less your problematization of how sustainability is not yet influencing HR practices. So this leads to the question actually of what is to be done, right? What can we now do? And Ultimately, of course, Andy, you have been talking about the focus on organizational performance. So very much the instrumentalistic approach towards HR as a function, which then translates into procedures. And all of this, of course, is very strongly related to the wider economic system, and more generally, of course, the neoliberal capitalist system that we have organized our global economy in. So, in that sense, organizations are competing with each other financially for shareholder value and market share and so on. So we are very much in that system, and organizations feel forced to comply with this system. So the question is also not just how do we transform organizations from within at the level of organizational functioning, but also the question is relevant in terms of do we actually want another system? And so in some ways, of course, there's also the kind of the comfort of our current economic system, our current unsustainable economic system, which has the ironic tendency to destroy the planet and to lead to climate disaster, but at the same time leaves us very inert. So as we have said, as Andy, as you also earlier talked about, on the one hand, there are some governmental action, but of course we know that it's by far not sufficient in terms of what global government is doing towards environmental collapse and so on. And on the other hand, it is about the individual responsibility to make your house sustainable and so on, and to recycle your waste and to stop eating meat. But at the same time, there is no kind of big movement towards systemic change, and part of that, of course, is in the comforting position that ultimately, when we fail, we can always blame the system, and we don't have to blame ourselves. So what we now see is that on the one hand, we see environmental collapse, so the utter unsustainability of the system, and Andy also nicely illustrated that with the unsustainability of workplaces, with stress and burnout on the rise. But we are not really tackling the system. So. And also we should not be too dogmatic about it as well, as if there would be one global economic system that structures the entire global economic system and so on. But actually, what we see is the emergence and the existence of multiple systems at the same time. So, for instance, now during the pandemic, what we see is that governments suddenly can turn socialist. And almost provide a universal basic income, offer great support for not just companies but also individuals, like we see in the US, where Joe Biden suddenly has turned into almost a social democratic president. And so we see we see a lot of systems at the same time. So for us, in the light of this discussion, of course, in the light of this webinar, the question is, what can we do at the workplace level? And Andy has already nicely illustrated the inert position that HRM is in, actually. And so what we need to be doing is, of course, imagine alternatives. So imagination is, of course, key here. And we have to dream and we have to fantasize about what kind of alternative realities can we actually imagine. We lack the utopian visions that have been existing in the past. For instance, if we look at the Soviet Union, and so on. During the Soviet Union era, people could at least dream about a life in freedom, which was existing in the West. Of course, after the fall of the wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was the big disappointment. But we are in an even worse position now, so to say, because we also lack alternative visions about how society could be organized. So, for instance, take inequality. There is now, since years, there is a lot of talk about the problem of income inequalities and inequalities in society. But if inequality is the problem, is equality then the solution? Now, for gender inequalities, we might argue, of course, and rightfully so, of course, that gender equality would be certainly a solution. But for income inequalities, there's perhaps a few people who would argue that entire income equality would be the solution, i.e. meaning that everybody basically would get the same kind of salary. So we are dealing with a problem of alternatives. Okay, yeah. Oh no, not too far. So if we look at the literature, if we look at what people are saying, experts are saying, what has been written about over the past many years, there is basically one solution that is coming back every time and again when we are talking about the crisis of sustainability, and that is democracy. We need more democracy, and let's focus now for this talk particularly on the workplace. And if we are looking at all of the problems as laid out earlier by Andy, democracy is over and over again is mentioned as the solution to what to the unsustainable workplace. But at the same time, what we are also observing, particularly in the West, and more generally, of course, beyond the workplace, is a crisis of democracy, just as a crisis of sustainability. So what we observe is that democracy is quite having big difficulty, so to say, with its own decline. So what you see in many countries nowadays is that people can democratically vote for the abolishment of democracy. And so democracy has no real protection against its own decline. Nonetheless, of course, we know that the only way through which we can make workplaces more sustainable is there we have the word again, the true involvement of people. So working towards truly sustainable workplaces means a true involvement of people in decisions that affect us all. So we need, in that sense, democracy. But at the same time, being confronted with the democratic decline, we are left in a position perhaps where we are now, and that is that we are stumbling upon another inertia, because we also perhaps have lost our belief in and our faith in democracy. For instance, take the contemporary elections, where democratic elections are usually turning out towards representation of elites as in our governments and so on, or people chosen into government who we do not really want to be representing us. So the question, therefore, is while so many enlightened speakers and thinkers and writers and experts have argued for the need to reassess and revalue democracy in the workplace, we still have to ask ourselves, okay, where to exactly? So Here we can turn, for instance, to the writings of the late David Graeber, who passed away last year or so, and who wrote a quite interesting a book around Occupy Wall Street, where he was involved in the protest of 2011, so it's already 10 years ago, but where he reiterated democracy as not just as a representation through elections, but as a process of consensus seeking. And I think this is the first value that we need to refine in terms of democracy in the workplace. And that is, democracy is not just a matter of electing people who represent us to take the decisions in our companies or in our country, but democracy is really about a process of consensus seeking. And so this consensus is not, or this consensus is more or less opposed to the danger of democracy, which is of course the tyranny of the majority, where if you just rely on democracy as a process of electing people, then the majority can basically decide the course of action. But democracy as a process of consensus seeking means that by definition, minorities will always be taken into account. And so here we find actually the link that through which we can start to rethink democracy in the workplace, and that is through a process of consensus seeking. And then still the question is, okay, how can we do this, or what does it mean then, this consensus seeking? Where, about what, and where do we seek this consensus? So here we can introduce the idea of dignity. And dignity, then we can use this term, and in order to make the final link that we of course have to make towards sustainability. And so this consensus through a process of democracy, so the deliberate process of involving all the relevant stakeholders in decision making, and so basically all people in the workplace, the involvement of all the people in the workplace, and perhaps also beyond the workplace, can be democratically organized in order to find consensus about the course of action. And where to then? Now here we introduce dignity, and so it should be a consensus on the dignified course of action in society, and more specifically here in the workplace. So in a more recent theorizing, dignity, which we of course can understand as the intrinsic worth of human beings. When we talk about human dignity, it is about the intrinsic worth of human beings. In the light of our discussions around sustainability, we stretch the idea of dignity beyond human beings. So very simply put, and very briefly put, how are we to decide whether a human being has dignity and an animal or the planet has no dignity? We are, as human beings, cannot decide on what has value and what has intrinsic worth, and not just grant it to ourselves as human beings, even though sometimes that has been argued. But in our theory, in our approach, we argue for the reverse, that the planet, our planet, basically, it's everything that we have, that we live on, that the planet itself has intrinsic worth. So basically everything that exists on the planet, whether it is human beings, whether it is animals, whether it is natural resources, our environment, our forests, our rivers, our seas, and so on, they have an intrinsic worth. And our duty, and there we come back to the duty of care, our moral duty of care that Andy talked about. Our duty of care is to respect and protect and promote the dignity in the workplace. So when we are part of an organization, our core task, our moral duty of care is to respect the dignity that the dignity of everything that we basically touch upon in our organization. So everything that will be part of our organizational process. So we talk about people. We may talk about using natural resources when we are a fossil fuel company, or when we are working with animals as a company, or producing food. We have to ask ourselves, okay, what is our duty of care towards the animals, the natural environments, the people? What is our duty of care towards them? And how can we respect, protect, and promote the dignity of each of these stakeholders, so to say, in the broadest sense? And so when we talk, for instance, about human beings, we can then get to a position where we, when we depart from a position of dignity, we can get to a position where we, as an organization, we are actively recognizing each individual human being as an individual. So you are who you are as an individual, but you're also at the same time a member of a group. Whether it is due to your nationality, due to your religion, due to your gender, or so on and so on. So that we are always, when we enter the workplace, we are always and an individual human being with our intrinsic dignity, but we are also a member of a group. So we also are part of the workplace, representing and being a part of the groups that we are. So returning then finally to the discussion around sustainability, because our duty is, of course, as organizations in the workplace, to become sustainable organizations. And here we return to the question, of course, what we mean with this truly sustainable workplace. Now, as Andy already, of course, said, and something we also analyzed in depth in the 2 previous webinars, is that currently sustainability is pretty much used as a PR term, as greenwashing, as whitewashing, as something that doesn't really have meaning. And here we try to obtain a more genuine meaning to what sustainability means in the workplace. And so we are actively and deliberately then linking sustainability with a process of democracy towards respecting and promotion of dignity of everything that we make part, basically, of our organizational process. And so first, the first implication here is that that we have to recognize that sustainability is multifaceted and usually an impossible paradox. So what we often see is that organizations are focusing on one type of sustainability. And so the second one, of course, is perhaps most prominent, that where we see that often, and certainly in the current pandemic, is that organizations and governments are trying to protect jobs and the economy. So basically, organizations and governments are trying to protect the dignity of human being, but they do that via destroying our very planet. So, for instance, in the Netherlands, where I come from, what we see is that the government is offering a lot of support, financial support to the airline industry to keep the jobs and keep the airline companies from not going bankrupt. But of course, they do so the protection of this industry and the people at the expense of course, the planet. So we're constantly struggling with impossible paradoxes here. And what we have to do here in order to create truly sustainable organization is that we first have to recognize that we need such integrative analysis, so that you cannot just separate human dignity in that sense, human sustainability from environmental sustainability. So in the case of support for an airline industry, at the same time, we also have to be aware that protecting the environment also cannot come at the expense of the dignity of human beings. And so we have to find a way in which we can and do this well and do this in a dignified way. But that means that we always, in our organizational action, in our organizational functioning, we, for instance, as HR department, we should also always be aware that we focus on not just one type of sustainability, but that it needs to be an integrative analysis of human sustainability, planetary sustainability, financial sustainability, and so on. And here we come back finally to the mediating mechanism, so to say, which is, of course, democracy, workplace democracy. Because how do we become aware of the prioritization of the various forms of sustainability and how they relate to each other? We need to be giving people a voice. And on the one hand, of course, people need to be able to express their voice in order to know how we can protect the dignity of people, not just within the organization, but also beyond the organization. But democracy is not just about having people being able to express their voice, but it's also about finding the space in democracy for those who have no voice, i.e., for instance, the planet, i.e., for instance, the animals, and so on. When the Amazon rainforest cannot speak for itself, to protect itself, we need democratic ways in order to be able to let the voices be heard, that in order to protect the dignity in that sense of the rainforest, as one example. So of course, this analysis is a very brief one, given in perhaps 15 minutes or so. So in order, the MSBA program itself, of course, will be a 2-year immersive program where it will be truly translated into the context of the students' own organizations. But this might perhaps provide a little taster of our approach towards it. Let me see. So that was the presentation part. Any questions in the meantime? From participants? Feel free to speak up or to respond or to react if you want to add or contribute something. Or then Andy, you can, or I can talk about the MSBA as well, or if you want to take over again.
Happy just to chat through a little bit of that to pick up from that. Thanks, Matthijs. Yeah, as Matthijs said, really what we've been, this gives a bit of a flavour of the sort of conversations and discussions we'll be having within this longer programme. We see it's an important programme to try and develop solutions that have an impact on the world. We do talk about these issues in education, but do we actually move towards developing some solutions, different ways to organise, different ways to manage? Those don't necessarily exist now. This is a programme where we might try and create those new ways of doing things. So we see it's quite a different style of programme, where we're not just talking from the side and critique from the side, which has often been a critique itself of higher education, but actually want to be responsible actors, responsible educators, to work with our students, work with people on the programme, to develop new knowledge, develop the solutions about how we might do things differently. How can we genuinely move our organisations so they are more democratic, so they are more dignified, so they do care more? That'll mean we have to do things differently in some way, and those things will have to be created, and created through dialogue, through discussion, through consensus. So the programme is also underpinned by all the values that Matthijs has been talking about there, underpinned by values of democracy, consensus, dignity and care, is how we want to run the programme as well, because that's how we'll develop the solutions to address some of these problems. So that's broadly what our programme is about. It's a 2-year programme, and we're going through a similar process over the 2 years of looking at problems, trying to understand problems more, and then building up to try and explain, build explanations, and then try to imagine different ways of doing things. So it's quite a practical programme in some ways. We might have work on the programme to address a law, try to change the law in a certain place. So there'll be real world projects that we try and tackle and create initiatives to move things forward. It's quite an immersive programme. We recognise that people coming onto the programme are likely to be people at work, practitioners from a wide range of sectors. And that we really want to we'll be running the programme in the style of 2-day immersive conference style events, really, with a wide range of speakers, input and engagement from the students, as well as academics and practitioners as well. That would be a 2-year programme that generates new thinking and ideas and solutions. And we hope that it demonstrates a lot of benefits, not just for the interest that we already get from speaking to our existing students and cohorts. There is a real desire from students to be doing things that make a difference. So I think at a participant level, there are people out there who want more rewarding careers. They want responsible careers. And this offers an opportunity to do that. And organisations are genuinely wanting to become, I think there's a sincere desire for organisations to become responsible, sustainable, more dignified and all of that. But how do we make that happen? How do we bring that about? It's a transformation, it's a change. And change is always difficult to bring about from the status quo. So this is about a means and a way to create a meaningful vehicle to make that happen. And that's really what the programme is about. So we're very happy to, if there's any debate to move on beyond this, we're very happy for people to contact us and for us to have a more lengthy debate, a discussion, an engagement. These ideas are best delivered through engagement and ideas, and that's really what we really want to do. So I think we'd be really happy to take any other questions or ideas. Stop sharing those slides so I can see my new thing.
Yeah.
We will be planning to do more of these events. So this is a series of events, and we'll do some more of these where we share really our dialogue of how we're debating and discussing around those things.
I was still thinking, between the difference between, because I emphasize the consensus and it's often confused with compromise. So there's a real distinction between, of course, a compromise and consensus. And these, you can see that very strongly politically, but also in organizations, that there's a real difference. So compromise is where you both basically agree on a suboptimal deal for both parties, just to get ahead, to get something done. Whereas consensus is a much more deliberate process where you take into account the interests and the needs of all the parties involved, not just people, but also, in that sense, the planet itself and so on. So I think that's also
ties very close.
Hmm?
That ties very closely to the idea of dialogue as well, which is almost the process of achieving consensus is dialogue.
Yeah.
And dialogue is much more about a deep conversation where you share come to some sort of shared understanding of a situation, and at least a shared recognition of the different meanings people might have, almost a sharing at the level of meaning. Whereas I think compromise is there isn't a sharing of meaning at all. We just agree to keep our separate positions or our different meanings. We don't try and construct a new meaning as we do in consensus. I think dialogue's a very powerful process for achieving that, and a dignified way to do it as well, because it does respect. It's a process where you do respect that there is another meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, if there's no other questions, then we could finish the webinar. The webinar will be also online. We're using it for interested students as well, or potential students, that they can have a look at the webinars we've run so far, and have a little bit of a taster of the discussions taking place, the approach, and so on. So they will be put online and used, and thank you for your interest, and then enjoy the rest of your day, I would say.
Thank you for joining. Thanks very much. Hopefully engage with some future events as well. Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.